Hello and welcome to this video on creating a moss ball. An otherwise mundane looking growth, but one that can have a huge impact when done right. Kokodama literally translates as moss and ball. Koka meaning moss and dama ball. It's seen some popularity again in recent years, notably as a gift or as a floral presentation. In other cases, it can be used as a living display that's more interesting. In this case, we're combining all of these elements to create a floral display with an azalea, but something that can be stylized. Kokodama is not so foreign to bonsai and other things we've described so far. The idea fundamentally is to create a mud ball. You then keep the roots within the mud ball, while surrounding it is sphagnum moss and then green moss. Similar in many ways to what you see with a bonsai. Traditionally, they've used very specific soil compositions, primarily relying on a heavy clay mixture. This is something you see regularly used in bonsai called Kokodama. One of the additions you add to it though is peat moss. This not only helps to retain moisture, but breaks up some of that solid mass, which helps with the growth of the plant. One of the easiest ways to get around getting both Kokodama, peat moss, and the other necessary ingredients is to simply make your own, using existing soil mixtures, some peat moss, and a bit of clay. The clay will help to bind everything together, so even though you can avoid it for the most part, you should try and have some in there to help keep it all together. Think of it as a binding agent of sorts. On top of the basic soil mixture, you'll need scissors, string, water, and your sphagnum moss for the outside of this. On top of that, you'll need to choose a plant species that will survive having at least somewhat damp roots. This means tropical species are ideal, but if you create the right mixture for the soil, you can get away with a wide variety. Just be aware that anything like a succulent or cacti that likes to have dry soil will not work. It doesn't matter what you try, the drainage just isn't enough. The first step is to moisten your moss mixture. This is generally done by putting in a large bucket of water and letting it soak for about an hour. Once it's soaked, you squeeze it out and you can lay it down on the ground. Or as you see here, we prepared the root ball first. Then we've packed the soil mixture around it, then surrounded this with sphagnum moss. By first compacting the soil around the root ball which has been teased apart, you ensure the soil is moved into between the roots. This gives you a nice solid soil mixture to start with. Then once you get your sphagnum moss, you also squeeze this around the root ball and soil mixture. This further compacts it and keeps everything in a nice tight mass. Once you have your initial layer of sphagnum moss, you should ensure you've squeezed as much water out as possible. The rest of it will drain out over time, but the more suitable the soil is now, the less shock the plant will have. Once this is done, you then put string around the moss. We found it easiest to use a slip knot for this initially, which allows us to tension it and tie down the sphagnum moss around the root ball more effectively. You then wind this around the ball as many times as required to ensure that the sphagnum moss is holding down tightly. We found that it's often necessary to do this once, go through a second time and identify any areas where the soil has come out, the sphagnum moss has gotten loose, or there isn't enough pressure by the string. You then pack extra moss, cover the soil or whatever is required, and then wrap a second layer of string around this newer layer of sphagnum moss. From here you have two choices. Choice one is that you can leave the sphagnum moss around the kokodama to eventually turn into regular garden moss. This will take time, but it will work as sphagnum moss likes to be kept moist, and moss likes to be kept moist as well. This means it will naturally find its way there. Option 2 is that you add the moss yourself, and you can see that here. By doing that, it's exactly the same process as with the bonsai. You simply place the moss around it in an appropriate way. For us, we've then proceeded to tie it down. This will help in ensuring the moss is well established on the surface and will spread. This is a relatively simple project to do, and depending on the time of year, it can sometimes be a very convenient way to kill time. Think of school holidays, seasonal arts and crafts or gifts, things like that, especially if someone likes their plants. Overall, it is a relatively simple thing to maintain, or at least until you need to repot it. And repotting in this case is generally quite simple. It simply involves removing the string, detangling the root ball from the soil mixture, putting in new soil mixture, and then remaking the Kokodama. You may wish to make it larger the second time round. You'll also need to prune and otherwise look after the Kokodama as normal. This means watering, fertilizer, and so on. It's a relatively simple process as said, but it may take you a few tries to get it right. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.